circumstances. Okay, so yesterday I had the opportunity to sit down with Thomas Sowell, and I wanted to bring that to you because it was really cool. Thomas Sowell is, of course, one of the foremost economists in America. He's a terrific thinker, and more importantly, Thomas Sowell is, I think, a real ethical guide for a lot of folks because he thinks about issues rationally. He has a brand new book out. I had a chance to sit down with him yesterday. Here's what it sounded like. Welcome to the show, Thomas Sowell, the leading economist in the United States and one of the great thinkers of the modern American scene. He has a brand new book out. It's called Discrimination and Disparities. I had the pleasure of reading it over the last couple of weeks. I've actually referenced it at least twice on the show since I read it. I think it's quite brilliant. Professor Sowell, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let me start with what I think is the most important part of the book. You make an argument with regard to the definition of discrimination, because people tend to lump all sorts of discrimination together. You talk about discrimination 1, 1B, and discrimination 2. Can you just explain what those are and what the difference is between them?
Yes, discrimination 1 is used in the sense of people who have discriminating tastes, meaning that they are very good at comparing things and making decisions accordingly. Discrimination 2 means almost the opposite, namely that once you've identified someone's identity, then that person's individual qualities don't matter. You will treat them negatively on the basis of that. And it's discrimination, too, that anti-discrimination laws have been passed to deal with.
And discrimination 1B is a different type of discrimination that you discuss as well. This would be the use of group data in order to make individual decisions in the absence of individual information. Is that right?
That's right. In other words, discrimination 1A would be judging each person as an individual. 1B would be judging individuals by the group that they come from in the absence of a high cost of information that would have a prohibitive cost.
And the reason that distinction is so important, you talk about it in the book, is because what people tend to do is lump all of these things together. So if you, for example, are a taxi driver in New York City and there's a higher crime rate in the black community, and so you don't pick up a particular black customer, people accuse you of being a racist, as opposed to simply you're using the information available to you. And the proper solution to that would be the Uber or Lyft solution, where you can actually profile the criminal backgrounds of potential customers, presumably.
Yes, and in fact, black taxi drivers do that just as white taxi drivers do.
So, Professor Sowell, one of the things that's great about the book, and I think the most important thing, is that you point out that just because there are disparities between racial groups, which is, of course, the most important thing people talk about in the country, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's some sort of vicious discrimination going on. There could be an informational-based discrimination 1B going on. There could be a behavioral discrimination type 1 going on. How is it that we should approach separating out the types of discrimination that are really insidious from the other types of discrimination when we just see a headline in the newspaper that says black folks have fewer homes than white folks, or black folks are committing more crimes than white folks, for example?
Well, I think that the crucial implicit assumption is that in the absence of discrimination and in the absence of any genetic differences, that people would be more or less randomly or equally spread out, and therefore there wouldn't be these differences. In point of fact, there are innumerable differences. One of the simplest ones that gets ignored all the time is that groups have different ages. That is, the Japanese Americans have a median age that is 20 years older than the median age of Mexican Americans. And so if you're talking about jobs that require, either long years of education or 10 years of experience or something like that, then just the demographic differences means you have no chance from the outset, even if Japanese Americans and Mexican Americans were absolutely identical in every other aspect.
And one of the things that this makes clear, your discussion of this discrimination, your book, Discrimination and Disparities, and the differences between groups, one of the things that this makes clear is that virtually all government programs that are directed at direct redistribution between groups are probably bound to fail because they're not taking into account the real reasons for the disparities in the first place.
That's very true.
So the book is Discrimination and Disparities. Professor Sowell obviously has written a number of books. I've recommended probably 10 to 15 of his books on the program already. His latest is really timely and really effective. Professor Sowell, one final question for you, because I know that we're a little short on time. There was a New York Times study that came out a couple of weeks ago, and the claim from the New York Times is that it showed that black boys particularly are facing discrimination in the United States, that black girls are not, and that among rich households, even household income is not a good predictor of future performance. The suggestion from the New York Times is that America is just more racist against black boys than black girls. What was your take on that study if you had a chance to look at it?
I haven't had a chance to look at it, but I see no reason whatever that one should expect boys and girls to behave the same any more than we would expect, Japanese Americans to be highly represented in baseball when their median age is in the upper 40s.
Again, the book is Discrimination and Disparities. Professor Sowell, thanks so much for taking the time. I really do appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to have you. It's always an honor, and we always appreciate that you take the time to be on the program.
Well, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've been looking forward to this, actually, for a couple of months. Dr. Thomas Sowell, how are you, sir?
Fine, thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you, and you've written another great book, Discrimination and Disparities. Now, when you sit down and write a book, I mean, you have to have a reason to do that. You got probably 1,000 different ideas you want to consider writing for a book, and you settled on this. Can you tell us why?
I think one of the central fallacies at the heart of so many poorly conceived policies is the presumption that in the absence of some sort of discrimination or other people, genetic differences, things, different individuals, groups, countries would tend to be more or less similar, if not absolutely equal, or at the very least random. And what makes that a fallacy is, first of all, factually, as you look around the world for facts, you don't find this anywhere. You don't look back through history, you don't find it. And what you find in many cases are very skewed distributions of all kinds of outcomes, not only among human beings, but in nature. And one of the things that struck me in going through geography is that 90% of all the tornadoes in the entire world are in one country, the United States. And you could run through a whole list of things like that. And yet when I turn to social policy, there's always the implicit assumption that all these different groups are the same. For example, this most recent thing about this terrible shooting in Florida, one of the factors that gets very little attention is that the young man who did this had been in all kinds of trouble in school, and yet the policies put in by the previous administration put tremendous pressures on schools not to punish or discipline people from one group more so than from another. And I don't know why you would have such a thing. Is it preordained that black males must have the same number of problems as Asian females or any other two groups that you might select? So I wanted to try to dispel that. If the book does nothing more than that, I think it will be something of a contribution.
Well, it's going to be a lot of a contribution because it's fascinating. You did your homework here, and you really do dig into geography and history and IQ tests and all these other things. And you come down to the bottom line, which is we're just not all equal now, are we?
And the other thing, and this is not even taking into account the time dimension. I mean, the same man is not equal to himself at different stages of life.
So this is being pushed. This is being pushed by the progressive left. Why do they do that?
You would have to ask them that. I think that it justifies their grasp for power because what they can say wherever there's not equal outcomes, that there's something wrong with the world rather than something wrong with their theories, and that therefore you need them to come in and solve the problem. And their history of solving problems over the past century is extremely unimpressive at best.
And you make the point, look, you can improve your lot in life, you can improve your community, we can improve the world, we can pursue peace and so forth and so on, but you need to do it the right way. You need to recognize that there are certain differences among men and women, and as you just pointed out, a man in a different time of history and so forth. And there's really nothing you can do about it, really nothing you probably should do about it.
Well, the one thing that we have to admit, but don't, is that there's nothing we can do about the past. It drives me crazy when I see all the things that are based on trying to rectify the past. You know, college admissions committees talk endlessly about they're choosing among different applicants. And, you know, one applicant may be better than another in terms of his objective academic credentials, but then he had all sorts of privileges that the other one didn't have. There's not a thing we can do about that. The only times we have any influence over is the present and the future. And I often think, suppose someone who was more deserving than Jonas Salk had been admitted to City College because even though he wasn't equal in academics and so on, he had to overcome more handicaps. The question is, would he been just as likely to create a vaccine against polio? I mean, you're not there to retrospectively reward people for their merit. You're there to try to put people in there who are most likely to add the most to the society as a whole in the future.
Mm-hmm. Let's address some of these. A real bugaboo with me, but still people promote it. The minimum wage laws.
It's been one of my many losing crusades for decades. The idea that you can simply arbitrarily set a wage rate for people independent of their productivity, and that this will have no effect on the probability that they'll be hired is insane when you think about it.
Mm-hmm. And what are the consequences of minimum wage laws?
A lot of consequences. The most important is that the people who have the least education, the fewest skills, and the least experience are the people who are less likely to keep their jobs when you have a minimum wage law. And this is sort of personal with me because the earliest data I have in testing this with data on employment among black teenagers is 1948. And it so happens that 1948 was the year that I left home as a black teenager with no high school diploma, no skills, no job experience. And I was able to get enough jobs to be able to support myself until such times as things got better. Thank heaven, the minimum wage at that point had been rendered utterly meaningless by inflation. In other words, the law was passed in 1938, and it hadn't been changed in 10 years, and this was 10 years of inflation. So all wages were far above the level specified in the law, and so it's as if there was no law. Now, as years go by and they begin to raise the minimum wage so as to be able to keep up with inflation, that's when you see unemployment among black and white teenagers both increase to multiples of what they were before. Moreover, in 1948, there was no significant difference between the unemployment rate among black teenagers and white teenagers. In the later years, a huge gap opened up so that black teenage unemployment became double or more what it was among whites. But this record does not make a dent on the people who are hell-bent to put in these laws and are oblivious to the consequences.
There's been a lot of efforts over the decades to control neighborhoods, communities, if you will. You call it imposed residential and social sorting. What has that gotten us? Where has that gotten us? It's
gotten a lot of polarization. One of the things that most people are unaware of is an attempt to move people out of public housing projects and into middle-class neighborhoods have received their most bitter resistance from black middle-class people, many of whom have saved up their money for years so as to be able to raise their families in a community away from the people who have the dysfunctional people that you find in some other neighborhoods. And now to have the government come along and put those very same people into the places they tried so hard to get to is just a betrayal.
So some communities are unsorted, as you put it, and other communities are sorted.
Yes.
Based on government edicts.
Yes. Well, the government is unsorting the people who sorted themselves. Because, Harlem and black communities elsewhere are internally sorted tremendously. That's something that most people are unaware of. Blacks are not living at random in Harlem. They weren't when I was there, and they aren't today.
It just seems so odd to me when I listen to you and step back and think about this. Why not just leave people alone?
Oh, that's the last thing the left can do. What else is there for them if they can't run other people's lives?
Thomas Sowell, I'd like to have you in another segment. Don't leave us. It's a great book, Discrimination and Disparities. Mr. Producer, put it on all my social sites, linked to Amazon. Folks, I want to strongly encourage you to get it. It's a very good, substantive, easy read, Discrimination and Disparities. I'll be right back. I'm here with Dr. Thomas Sowell, his great new book, Discrimination and Disparities. Let's see, I lost my place. Well, anyway, among other things here in your book, it's not a very long passage, but you talk about slavery and how we don't really understand the history of slavery, and so in many cases there's a lot to learn from the history of slavery. Tell everybody.
Well, yes, good heavens. Slavery, people have no idea that slavery was not a matter of blacks and whites. It is very doubtful that if most of the people who were either slaves or were enslavers were either blacks or white, because it occurred all over the world. I mean, you know, Christian monasteries in Europe and Buddhist monasteries in Asia all had slaves. It was universal. At the time the United States was formed in 1776, Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, came out that same year. And Adam Smith pointed out that the only place in the world where slavery had been abolished was Western Europe. And, of course, the Western Europeans had slaves on the Western Hemisphere. So this is a ubiquitous human institution. John Stuart Mill in the middle of the 19th century pointed out that virtually all races of people had been slaves at one point or another. None of that comes through today because slavery is seen like everything else in terms of how it will help or hinder the agenda of the left. And so they now present it as if blacks were the only people, and they present it as, in roots, unfortunately, as if blacks went to Africa and enslaved slaves, the African people. In point of fact, in Africa, as in many other places, some people enslaved those who were near to them. That is, the other Africans enslaved the Africans and then sold them to the Europeans. But there was no nonsense about it, in most cases, of Europeans going to Africa and actually directly enslaving people.
And you point out that in Europe, Europeans enslaved Europeans, depending on who the Europeans were.
The very word slave comes from the word for Slavs, because Slavs were people massively enslaved for centuries before there was ever a single African brought to the Western Hemisphere.
Mm-hmm. And apparently it'll be controversial if you point these things out, isn't it?
Well, it comes like a bolt from the blue. But in point of fact, there are people who devoted their lives to researching slavery around the world, and they say it, and it's a common understanding among them that yes, that's true. Everybody was enslaved.
You know, you have a passage here that really caught several of them, but this one. Among the appalling things about the past, it is hard to know which was the worst, since there are all too many candidates from around the world for that designation. That something like the Holocaust could have happened after 1,000 years of civilization, and in one of the most advanced societies, is almost as incomprehensible intellectually as it is devastating morally and in terms of showing what depths of depravity are possible in all human beings. It is a painful reminder of a description of civilization as a thin crust over a volcano. You're saying here today, gone tomorrow. I mean, things are not permanent.
No, by no stretch of the imagination. One of the most scary things about reading the history of various groups, and especially hostilities among groups, is that you can have whole generations of groups that peacefully coexist, and then something will come along. It might be an incident, or it might be some talented demagogue. And the next thing you know, they're at each other's throats. And it's infinitely harder to put a stop to it than it is to get it started.
What do you make of what's going on in the country today? It's pretty bad, don't you think?
Yes. Well, not more than that. The polls show that people, in general, regard race relations as worse than they were in the past. And if you believe the left, you see the problems all were due to poverty and so forth. Well, in the era when there was far more poverty, you had far less of this than you have today. I mean, and there was a time when it was common for whites to go into Harlem. If they had friends there, they could visit them in their homes. They could go into the theaters. Most people are unaware. When Milton Friedman was a graduate student at Columbia, he used to go dancing at the Savoy Ballroom with Rose. And in her later years, when they wrote their joint autobiography, she referred at one point to how good it was in those long gone days, as she put it, to ride the IND subway. Now, the IND subway uptown went through Harlem. That was where the A train was that you hear about in Duke Ellington's theme song, Take the A Train. And so here's Milton Friedman, 5'2", and Rose about the same size, going to the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem to dance. And he said, no fear. No one accosted them, much less mugged them, and so on. And all of that shot. One of the moments I remember painfully was being in a high school in Harlem, and as I looked out the window, I mentioned to the students that when I was a teenager, I used to walk my dog in that park, and looks of horror came over the students' faces that nobody in his right mind today would dare venture into that park. And I realized what a different world we lived in, even when we lived in the same Harlem.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of Milton Friedman, you were quite friendly with Milton Friedman, weren't you?
He was a great man.
And he would have you on, and you were quite friendly with Bill Buckley. You were on firing line several times.
Oh, yes.
Do you think we miss that kind of broadcasting and intellectual back and forth in the public square?
Oh, no question about it. No question about it. There was also a greater honesty. I remember my first semester at Harvard when my roommate, who was white, said to me, Tom, when are you going to stop goofing off and get some work done? And I was shocked because I thought I was working hard. Well, from where I come from at Howard University in Washington, I was working hard. But now, once the grades came out, it was clear that I was now in the big leagues, and I just had to work harder. And I did fine from there on out. But how many white roommates are going to say that to a black student today?
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't, and so instead of turning him around so he can have a better life as well, people say all kinds of mealy mouth things, and the kid goes down the drain who didn't have to necessarily go down the drain.
I'm going to read you another sentence or two. Maybe I should have started with this, but it's also something I marked in your excellent book. And by the way, the book is Discrimination and Disparities. It's not a really, really thick book, but it covers a lot of territory, and you read it very, very quickly. It says, you wrote, while it might seem plausible that equal, or at least comparable, outcomes would exist among people in various social groups, in the absence of some biased human intervention or some genetic differences affecting those people's outcomes, neither belief survives the test of empirical evidence. And you go on to prove that.
Yes. But you can look in vain for what people talk about when they're creating social policy. The different groups would have the same kind of outcomes if it weren't for some kind of bad thing happening. Well, there are so many factors involved in most endeavors, and there are so many combinations and permutations of those factors. It would be a miracle if different groups all had the same outcomes.
And yet, the great equalizer, as you say, as Walter says, as Friedman would say, and Hayek and Mises and the founders would say, is individual liberty. That's the great equalizer.
Well, yes, one of the things that's truly frustrating that I can only allude to in passing in the book is that there have now been created in various black communities across the country some highly successful charter schools where the black kids not only meet national standards, exceed national standards, and in some cases exceed the standards in affluent, predominantly white suburban schools. You would think that people would be saying Hosanna and cheering them on. The hostility that these charter schools have attracted, they have been, opposed by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The Congressional Black Caucus is opposed to charter schools. And yet these schools have brought a level of education that only the most optimistic person would even have thought possible when they open up in places like Harlem and the South Bronx and Bedford-Stuyvesant. And they choose the students by lottery rather than by ability, and they still succeed. And it shows just how utterly distorted the world has become, that these things are under political attack.
Dr. Sowell, I could talk to you all day long. I'm sure you would enjoy that. But you really are a treasure to this nation. I've read you all my life. I've followed your columns. Whenever I could catch you on TV, I would catch you on TV. And you've always made me smarter. And I think I speak for the millions of people who are listening to this program. And I want to thank you very much for coming on the program today.
Well, Well, thank you for having me.
All right. God bless. He is so special. And the book is Discrimination and Disparities by Thomas Sowell. I want to strongly encourage you to get a copy of this. I'm telling you, the light bulbs will go off and your eyes will open widely. He has the ability, and very few do, to concisely address issues in plain English. He'll walk you through history. He'll walk you through facts, as very few can. And that's why he is so remarkable. And I know you enjoyed that last 20 or 30 minutes. I certainly did. I could listen to him all day. The book is Discrimination and Disparities, Dr. Thomas Sowell. I want to strongly encourage you, while you're listening to me, go ahead to Amazon. You can go through my Facebook site, Mark Levin Show Facebook, Mark Levin Show Twitter, or directly to Amazon and get his brand new book. It's well worth reading. I'll be right back.
Mark